Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. We're pleased that you can join us for this very special seminar with Dr. Paul Mariani, God in the Imagination, Praying Through Poetry. My name is Eric Goldschmidt. I'm the director of the Church in the 21st Century Center. And our event today is co-sponsored with the English department. This is our concluding event for our C21 series for the semester on the theme of exploring the Catholic intellectual tradition. And you most likely saw the magazine that kicked us off for these events and the theme for the semester. If you are not receiving and you would like to, the magazine is a free subscription. It comes twice a year. And we have these cards at the front table. You can sign yourself up, or you can sign up a friend or family member for the subscription, or if you want to take a couple and to share with your friends. That's a service of Boston College. Today's seminar will last about 2 hours. We're getting a little bit of a late start, but we're going to go for 2 hours, and we'll take then a break right in the middle. So we don't delay any longer, allow me to introduce our very distinguished speaker this evening. Paul Mariani grew up in Long Island, the eldest of 7 children. He earned his bachelor's degree from Manhattan College, a master's from Colgate University, and a PhD from the City University of New York. He taught for 32 years at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he became a distinguished professor of English. In 2000, he came to Boston College as the university professor of English. He's lectured and read his poetry around the United States, in Canada, and in Europe. Paul Mariani has published over 200 essays and reviews and is the author of 17 books, including 5 biographies, 7 volumes of poetry, several critical studies of modern poetry, and a spiritual memoir. He has served as the poetry editor of America magazine, the Jesuit Weekly, from 2000 to 2006. His poems have been widely anthologized and have appeared in numerous journals and quarterlies. He has been honored with fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2009, he was awarded the John Chardy Award for Lifetime Achievement in Poetry. And the C21 Center was honored to have included an essay by Paul Mariani in this recent issue of C21 Resources. And we are especially honored to have Paul Mariani lead this seminar tonight. Paul Mariani most certainly embodies the Catholic intellectual tradition at Boston College, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you.
Welcome, my captain.
First of all, this is on, right? You can hear me? Yes, good. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out from your busy schedules to come here today. I thought, by way of beginning, just take a moment, prayer. Since this is on prayer and poetry, I want to say, come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, we shall be created, and we shall renew the face of the earth. O Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit. I want to do a number of things today. I want to open this at the appropriate point for questions so that we can have it interaction and interchange. I want to do that. I want to talk a little bit. I want to read some poems that talk about them, why I've chosen them, And what we're trying to do here with the sense of prayer on the one hand and poetry on the other. A number of times I've made Jesuit retreats, and I've gone up to Gloucester, up to Eastern Point. And I was surprised a couple of years ago when my director said, you know what I want you to do this weekend is write poetry. No, weekend this week. Write poetry. I want you to just write poetry. I was surprised because I'd made the 30-day retreat there. I'd done the more, shall we say, the more Jesuit way of doing things. But this was a kind of surprise to me. And I was a little, and even though I write poetry, I was a little uncomfortable with it. But what happened is that the prayer elements and the poetry elements got stronger and stronger as the week went on. And the thing is, I've really believed for a very long time that prayer and poetry are really intertwined. When I write, I try to always start, whatever I'm writing, whether it's poetry or prose or biography or memoir, just to kind of focus myself with a prayer, and then sometimes a Lectio Divina of some sort, and then with my wife, and then I get into the day's work, you know. I thought I would start with a poem here by W.S. Merwin, which he wrote when he was a young man at Princeton University. It's the first poem in the sheaf that you've been handed. Merwin was an undergraduate at Princeton, and he was fortunate enough to have for his teacher John Berryman. Okay, now some of you may know Berryman's work is extraordinary. The Dream Songs, especially Homage to Mistress Bradstreet, other poems like that. And this is when the young student asked his teacher at Princeton, okay, what about poetry? How do you know when you've written a poem? What is poetry? How do you go about doing it? This is what Berryman told him. He said, I will tell you what he told me. In the years just after the war, as we then called the Second World War, don't lose your arrogance yet, he said. You can do that when you're older. Lose it too soon and you may merely replace it with vanity. Just one time he suggested changing the usual order of the same words in a line of verse. Why point out a thing twice, he suggested. I pray to them twice. He suggested I pray to the muse, get down on my knees and pray right there in the corner. And he said he meant it literally. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but it was deep in tides of his own, through which he had sailed, chin sideways and head tilted like a tacking sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was. He was in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. As for publishing, he advised me to paper my wall with rejection slips. His lips and the bones of his long fingers trembled with the vehemence of his views about poetry. He said the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it in poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. I had hardly begun to read. I asked, how can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? And he said, you can't. You can't. You can never be sure. You die without knowing whether anything you wrote was any good. If you have to be sure, don't write. There you go. Good advice. If you have to be sure, don't write. I teach a course here at Boston College called God in the Imagination. It's something I've wanted to teach for a long time, and finally I got the text together and I've been teaching it, and it seems to always go well. That is, at least students come to it, which is something. And I'll be teaching again in the fall. And the way I structure it, I was fortunate enough when I was just starting out for my PhD back in the In 1964, I was at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and I was so lucky to have as my mentor Alan Mandelbaum. He's passed away last year, but he was an extraordinary translator of Dante. Okay, he had extraordinary translation of Dante. He also did Midway. I remember when I was in his class, and he said, "Paul, I'm going to stop to Dante for a while." He said, "I have to translate Virgil now." He said, because Virgil was the teacher of Dante. So I'm going to have to get to the Virgil, and then I can come back to Dante refreshed. And so he did. So he translated from the Latin, then he went back to the Italian. He'd already translated poets, Italian poets like Quasimodo, Montale, Ungaretti, Giudici, others. And then he went on to translate from the Greek, Homer. And then he went back to the Latin again with Ovid. He was a real model for me, an extraordinary model. But I think in homage to him and what he taught me about Dante, I found that for the course that I teach in God and the Imagination, that I would structure it around hell, the purgatory or the way or the journey, and then the paradise, the sense of moving towards some kind of vision. And of course I can't teach it all and teach everything else, in the course that I do, but I use this as the grid, okay? And so I thought we'd start just because, the more I write poetry, the more I look for poetry, say in a religious tradition, the thing is, no one has surpassed Dante. No one has even reached Dante. And we're talking about a man who was writing back in 1300, as far as that Christian Catholic vision. Just no one has been able to do it. He's attracted so many translators. There he is. So I use him as a kind of guide, as though it were Virgil and then Dante, and then I follow like about 30 steps behind and say, okay, what can I learn? What can I learn? And I just want to read a little bit from the Purgatorio, the Canto 28, because what we're doing is we're moving from hell. We're moving now into the, where it's so dark. It's darker than the Sopranos, okay, just to give you a sense, okay? I mean, it's darker than Django. I mean, it's very dark, okay? And we move from there, and then we move into the way, where we, as human beings, are pilgrims. That is, on the way. We're not damned, yet we're not there yet. Okay, we're on the way. Beautiful movie called The Way, about St. James Compostela, moving up on the way. And here's what he says he looks ahead, and Dante had a reputation, I don't know if you know this, in his own lifetime with people like Guido Cavalcanti and others who knew him personally, part of the gang in Florence, okay? And they said, Dante, what is he doing writing about heaven? I know this guy. I know about his womanizing, etc., okay? And yeah, so Dante had clay feet. What happened was he begins now, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, halfway through now, he says, wait a minute, I've got to take a look at what I'm doing here. Time is running on, and it's time to move forward. And there is some extraordinary sections in the poem as he moves towards seeing Beatrice again, the young girl who had died, to whom his heart remains in a very, very deep sense, but a spiritual sense. And in fact, she's the one who is guiding him. He doesn't know that yet, but she's guiding him from heaven upward. But now he says, and I'll read some of this. I saw a solitary woman moving, singing, and gathering up flower on flower. By the way, this is Alan Mandelbaum's translation that I'm using. That flowers that colored all of her pathway. I pray you, lovely lady, you who warm yourself with rays of love, if I may trust your looks, which often evidence the heart, may it please you, I asked her, to move ahead and closer to this river. so that I may understand what you are singing. I love this language. How it's filled with that late medieval, early Renaissance courtoisie, a sense of courtesy that you extend to the other. Use politeness, a sense of you're on your very, very best behavior, as though you were in a courtly dance, you see. You have reminded me of where and what, just when her mother was deprived of her, and she deprived of spring, Proserpina was. The spring, Proserpine going down into hell, then rising up again, that sense of loss and resurrection. I had beseeched, and I was satisfied, for she approached so close that the sweet sound that reached me then became intelligible. No sooner had she reached the point where that fair river's waves could barely bathe the grass than she gave me this gift, lifting her eyes. That's the gift. She actually deigns to look right into Dante's eyes, and he is stunned by that. I do not think a light so bright had shone beneath the lids of Venus when her sun pierced her in extraordinary fashion. Erect along the farther bank she smiled, her hands entwining varicolored flowers, which that high land, needing no seed, engenders. Now where he's going, what he will come to realize is that he's actually returning to the Garden of Eden. He's returning to a pre-lapsarian world, the world before Adam and Eve, fell, okay? He's returning to that, where it might have been, where there would be this extraordinary, beautiful discourse between a man and a woman, for example. You are here, you are new here, and may, because I smile in this place, chosen to be mankind's nest, wonder, perplexed, unable to detect the cause, but light to clear your intellect is in the psalm beginning delectasti. What she's saying is, if you want to know what I'm talking about, then I have a note for you on that, 2 pages on. This is Psalm 91. And she says, and the psalm begins, Thou didst delight me, Lord, in my work, and in the works of thy hands I will rejoice. How praiseworthy are thy works, O Lord. And you, who have stepped forward, who beseeched me, tell me if you'd hear more. I have come ready for all your questions till you're satisfied. And I said, the water and the murmuring forest contend in me against the recent credence I gave to words denying their existence. At this she said, I'll tell you how the source of your amazement has its special cause. I'll clear the cloud that's left you so distraught. Notice how much she is teaching him, because he's ready now. He's ready to hear her, you see. The highest good, she says, whose sole joy is himself, made man to be and to enact good. He gave man this place as pledge of endless peace. Man's fault made brief his stay here, and man's fault made him exchange frank laughter and sweet sport for lamentation and for anxiousness. What it should have been this kind of discourse between a man and a woman with frank laughter and sweet sport. The water that you see, now there's a small, tiny stream. It's only like you could jump across it or even walk across it, but he can't go across it. He's not ready to go across that stream yet. And she tells him, the water that you see does not spring from a vein that vapor cold condensed restores, like rivers that acquire or lose their force. It issues from a pure and changeless fountain. This is extraordinary. This is what John of the Cross also spoke about, this endless, changeless fountain, which continually renews itself, which is really God's grace, is what it is, God's Spirit, which by the will of God regains as much as on the two sides it pours and it divides. On this side it descends with power to end one's memory of sin, and on the other it can restore recall of each good deed. I was so struck by this. I said, oh my gosh, so that's what happens. Or at least that's what we hope happens. That is the sense that we have two rivers, Lethe and Untitled. And what she's saying is, when you taste of this water, two things happen so that you can be ready to come across into the paradise, land of paradise, a sense of complete rest. One is that you will forget your shortcomings. You will forget your sins. You will forget them. You won't have to worry over them anymore, what you did. Okay, that'll be gone. And on the other side, with Naomi, on the other side, you will remember the good things that you did. Now you just have to hope that you did something good. That's But you will remember the good things, and that's what you will bring with you. The evil, sadness, and all of that, that'll be gone. That'll be erased. But on the other side, all the good will blossom that you did. Here mankind's root was innocent, and here were every fruit and never-ending spring, these streams, the nectar of which poets sing. And then I turned round completely, and I faced my poets. Now, here's what he's doing. Dante is working out of a Catholic, Christian tradition, but he's being followed by all of the great classical figures like Virgil, and others. And they are behind him, and he turns around and he looks at them and he says, I could see that they had heard with smiles this final corollary spoken. And that done, my eyes returned to the fair woman. In other words, he looks around and she has said what the classical poets spoke about when they spoke about a golden age, when they spoke about a sense of peace at the end. That was a foreshadowing of what I'm speaking about to you. So there's a combining then, you see, of the classical vision, if you will, and the Judeo-Christian vision, okay? So I wanted to start with that because it's just so extraordinary. I mean, Dante didn't get there easily. It took him 20 years of writing to get to this point. I remember Alan Mandelbaum telling me when we began the Inferno, he said, I don't know how good your Italian is, but if you listen to this carefully, where he's starting from, you'll see that he's halting. It's good poetry, but he's learning how to write. And the more he writes, the better he's going to get at it. And then he would read the passages, and then he would read the later passages. And you could just hear in the music itself that Dante was in another world. He had arrived at another place, you see. Okay. Now, I wanted to look at a couple of other poems here by other voices. In this case, in the Anglo-Catholic and in the what we call the Roman Catholic tradition. And one of them is by Father Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins, a Jesuit priest, okay? It's called As Kingfishers Catch Fire, and he wrote it just a few months before he actually was ordained as a priest. He was in Wales, okay, at St. Byno's in northern Wales in 1877, in the spring of 1877. And there's this gift that comes to him. He's been, oh boy, he had given up writing poetry when he became a priest. He thought that the two couldn't match, that somehow you couldn't be both. I mean, he was wrong, as his own work shows, okay? But he wanted to give 100%, so he gave up the poems that he had written when he was at Oxford as an undergraduate, okay? And then some poems that he had written shortly after that, he burned a lot of them is what he did, okay? Now we have diaries and we have drafts of some of those poems, but that's what he did. He made a little holocaust and he burned them and he said, I'm sacrificing this. And for a long time he didn't write anything. And then he went through his Jesuit training, and then when he was finishing up theology at St. Byno's in the winter of 1875, there was a terrible tragedy. A ship called the Deutschland went down right off the coast of England. It had come in from Bremen. It had come in from Germany, and there were a number of nuns on board who were on their way to America, actually to St. Louis, I think, and there they would, once they had learned the English, they would be nurses, they'd be teachers, they would work in the, because they'd been expelled, you see, from under Bismarck's laws. Bismarck had closed many of the monasteries and churches. And there were 5 nuns on there, and all 5 drowned, okay? So it's the same question, I suppose, that Milton asks, okay, how do you explain this? How do you explain all this good that's suddenly just taken away like that, along with, of course, something like 150 other passengers as well. In fact, the first boats to go out after the terrible storm, winter storm, passed were salvaging boats, not people there to rescue, but people to pick up salvage, okay? Human nature being what it is, or can be. Anyway, he writes the Wreck of the Deutschland, and then he gives himself permission to write, and he writes a series of sonnets. This is one of them that I'd like to read. It's called As Kingfishers Catch Fire. It's an extraordinary piece. I'll explain it a little bit. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy wells stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more. The just man justices, keeps grace. That keeps all his goings grace. Acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. There's a lot here. Let's just go over it a little bit, okay? He says, there he is in North Wales, and he looks out and he sees a kingfisher darting down toward, to catch a fish, down as it shoots down. And he says, as you look at the kingfisher, it's not conscious that it's doing this, but it almost looks like a flame as it darts down into the water. Okay, it's alive. It's in verb. It's in doing be. What Hopkins calls a kind of doing be. It's alive with life. You see, and he says the same way. He says then you take a dragonfly, and notice how as it moves around in the sun, it seems to catch the light and seems almost to draw, literally to etch out flame as it moves around. You see, that's one meaning of it. You see, I mean Hopkins has a very good sense of seeing what's right in front of him. And he says, all right, or take a stone. He says, as tumbled over rim and roundy wells, stones ring. So you have a stone. It's not going to move much unless someone pushes it or, rain or something comes. But if it falls into a well, it makes a sound. Ka-plunk. That's distinctive to that stone. So even a stone, it kind of reminds me of Christ in Jerusalem. If these people were to be silent, the very stones, you see, would ring out. That sense would cry out. And then he says, and then he actually imitates the sound. He says, it's sort of like the way you pluck at a violin or a guitar or a banjo, he says, like each tucked string tells, you can almost hear it, tucked string, a pizzicato, you see, a sound. And he says, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue. And now you go from a slight pizzicato to this heavy bells like in a tower. Bong, 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 bong. You see, you can hear that too. Each, he says, to fling out broad its name, across all of Oxford or across London, you see. He says, each mortal thing does one thing and the same. And what does it do? It says itself. It deals out that being indoors. Each one dwells, but it has to do it in action. The bell can sit there, you see, forever, and it's not doing its belling, you see what I mean? Or the strings on a musical instrument are doing nothing if they're just there. They have to be played. So it's that sense of activity, of doing be, the verb at the core of it. The kingfisher, not Audubon, say shooting a kingfisher and then painting it. No, not that. But the living thing itself, you see, the thing in action. He says, it goes itself. He says, crying what I do is me, and for that I came. But by the way, that line too, doesn't that have a Christian message? This is why I came into the world, Christ says, right? Okay. This is why I came into the world. And then he turns to us and he says, what do we do? He says, I'll tell you what we do. If you call yourself a just person, then you better justice. In other words, you better do justice. Do it. You know, St. Francis saying at one point, he says to a young Franciscan, he said, go out and preach into the world, and if you have to use words sometimes, right? Okay, you know, that sense. The just man justices, keeps grace, and that keeps all his goings graces. Just by acting and doing the right thing, he says, that is how you know this person is just, that this person is in God's eyes. Acts in God's eye, what in God's eye he is. Well, what are we in God's eye? What are we? How does God see us? Hopkins says. He says, I'll tell you what he sees. He sees in each one of us Christ. That's what he sees. Each one of us. In the incarnation, each of us takes on, or can take on, the life of Christ. We become the sons and daughters of God. For Christ, he says, plays. I love that, plays. It's, see the sense of it. You don't have to, it's not something somber and, just be who you are. Enjoy it. You have a duty to enjoy. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his. To the Father, through the features of men's faces, so that you see in the face of the other, in the smile, in the eyes, a glimpse of Christ. This is what Hopkins is saying. Okay, I want to make sure that all right, and then I have, I go from there, that's 1877, and then I look at a different figure, and that's T.S. Eliot, okay? And Eliot's Little Gidding. Okay, now you know the Prufrock, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, The Wasteland, and now his last major poem is the fourth part of his four quartets, Little Gidding, okay? And here's a man, T.S. Eliot, the American from St. Louis, also from Eastern Point, where they had a summer home up here, and then moving to London, becoming a British citizen, but he's still an American at heart, okay? And in the Little Gidding, each of the four quartets is named after a place. Three of them are in England. One of them is in the United States. And the fourth one, though, is Little Gidding. And what he does is he sees himself as a pilgrim returning to a community under Nicholas Ferrar, in the 17th century, an Anglican community, an experimental community of men and women living together, you see, in prayer. And what happened to that community is that finally, with the Roundheads, with Oliver Cromwell, that is, and the others, when they killed the king, they also closed, one of the things they did was to close down, to destroy pretty much Little Gidding as well, okay, as being too far. I mean, it would be almost like, say those on the far left saying, it's got to go, it's too far, it's got to go, the radicalization of that. And so Eliot he writes it, he finishes it in 1942. Now think about that, 1942, he's in England, he's living in London, the war's going on, World War II, okay? German Stuka bombers, coming over, bombing London. And just a little aside, I used to have, my neighbor years and years ago was T.S. Eliot's secretary. And she said, I remember Tom. She said, I remember Tom during the war. He was supposed to be a fire warden, but he always sent me out to do the work. I don't know, maybe. But here he is now. Notice how he begins, that this Pentecostal moment. And he says this Pentecostal moment, this moment of flame, actually comes in the midst of what? In the midst of winter. Midst of winter. And he calls it midwinter spring, is its own season. Sempiternal, though sodden towards sundown. What he's getting at here is this moment of sudden, in the midst of darkness, St. John of the Cross, for example, in the midst of darkness, suddenly things light up. And there's a moment of grace, a Pentecostal moment of grace. Suspended in time between pole and tropic, when the short day is brightest, with frost and fire. It's sort of, he says, it's like you're walking along, it's a freezing day, and there's a ditch on the side, and you suddenly look down, and the sun hits the frozen ditch, and the light is so intense it almost blinds you. Okay, so in the midst of winter, you can have this extraordinary moment of light. Okay, that's what he's getting at here. The brief sun flames the ice on pond and ditches. In windless cold that is the heart's heat, reflecting in a watery mirror a glare that is blindness in the early afternoon. And glow more intense than blaze of branch or brazier stirs the dumb spirit. No wind but Pentecostal fire in the dark time of the year. Between melting and freezing, the soul's sap quivers. There is no earth smell or smell of living thing. This is the springtime, but not in time's covenant. We would expect spring, okay, we say, okay, yes, with all the daffodils coming up, and all the tulips at this time of the year, and the forsythia, we've been waiting for this for very long. We deserve this, you see, and it's finally come. But he says, no, he says, when you least expect it, outside of our own plans, God enters. That's when you know it's God, you see. This is the springtime, but not in time's covenant. Now the hedgerow is blanched for an hour with the transitory blossom of snow, a bloom more sudden than that of summer, neither budding nor fading, not in the scheme of generation. Where is the summer? The unimaginable zero summer. That beautiful contradiction, paradox, the zero summer at the core, at the heart. Where is it? I know it exists. I felt it. I'm not making this up. I know it's there, he says. And then he goes on and he says, now if you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to, this is the way now, the way, taking the route you would be likely to take from the place you would be likely to come from. If you came this way in May time, you would find the hedges white again in May with voluptuary sweetness. It would be the same at the end of the journey. If you came at night, like a broken king, if you came by day not knowing what you came for, it would be the same. When you leave the rough road and turn behind the pigsty to the dull facade and the tombstone. One of the things that he's talking about is, as Charles I, was trying to escape, with the royalists, he stayed here. He came here for refuge. He didn't stay very long, but he came to Little Gidding for refuge and then had to move on. And he was captured shortly after. And then he was tried and, of course, beheaded, executed, But a broken king is not only King Charles, of course, but Christ, Christ the broken king in the crucifixion. And what you thought you came for is only a shell. This is true. Anytime you make a retreat, whenever I'm going there to do this, you've got all these plans, and of course then the reality of it is you encounter God, right? Changes the whole thing, which is great. He's got a great sense of humor, and it just keeps changing and getting better. He says, a husk of meaning from which the purpose breaks only when it is fulfilled, if at all. So that means you have to focus, you have to concentrate. Well, what was my real purpose for coming here? Not what I thought I was coming for, but what was I being called for, really, you see? And what you thought, either you had no purpose, possible, no purpose at all, you just came like a tourist, or the purpose is beyond the end you figured and is altered in fulfillment. There are other places which also are the world's end. Some at the sea jaws, or over a dark lake, in a desert or a city, but this is the nearest in place and time, now and in England. If you came this way, taking any route, starting from anywhere, at any time or at any season, it would always be the same. You would have to put off sense and notion. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity or carry report. Those are not the reasons you should be here. Okay? To carry back a report that you can write it up, or to inform your curiosity. What was it like on that retreat or going up there? None of that. He says, here's why you're here. You are here, he says, to kneel where prayer has been valid. That's it. It's not about you. It's about God and you. And prayer is more than an order of words, the conscious occupation of the praying mind or the sound of the voice praying. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire. Beyond the language of the living here, the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never, and always. See what Eliot's also, and he will say this in all of his 4 quartets. He says, "What can poetry do? What can language do? How close can it get me to the reality of God?" And he realizes that it will always come short. It must. In fact, it's in the interstices between the words, in the silence, perhaps, that we come closest to God. Nevertheless, that doesn't stop poets from writing, okay? As they keep trying and trying and trying. Okay. One more, I think, and then I'd like to open it up, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back, okay? I'd like to read this beautiful poem by Denise Levertov, okay? I remember I used to teach Denise Levertov way back in the 60s when she was during the Vietnam War, when she was writing many of her war poems, and social reform poems, etc. Later, she would write religious poetry, extraordinary. I remember being on a retreat, in fact, and my director, the first thing he gave me, he said, here, take this poem. This is the poem right here, the Annunciation. He says, take it and go to your room and meditate on it all day. Okay? That's all? Just read it, think about it, come back to it again, read it, come back to it again. Think of it in terms of, say, the Jesuit exercises. Okay, try that with this poem. And it was extraordinary, and it's never left me after that. Here's what Denise Levertov writes. The Annunciation. We know the scene, the room, variously furnished, almost always a lectern, a book, always the tall lily. Arrived on solemn grandeur of great wings, the angelic ambassador, standing or hovering, whom she acknowledges, a guest. But we are told of meek obedience. No one mentions courage. The engendering spirit did not enter her without consent. God waited. She was free to accept or refuse. Choice integral to humanness. Aren't there annunciations of one sort or another in most lives? Some unwillingly undertake great destinies, enact them in sullen pride, uncomprehending. More often, those moments when roads of light and storm open from darkness in a man or woman are turned away from in dread, in a wave of weakness, in despair, and with relief. Ordinary lives continue. God does not smite them, but the gates close, the pathway vanishes. She had been a child who played, ate, spelt like any other child, but unlike others, wept only for pity, laughed in joy, not triumph. Compassion and intelligence fused in her, indivisible. Called to a destiny more momentous than any in all of time, she did not quail, only asked a simple, "How can this be?" And gravely, courteously, took to heart the angel's reply, perceiving instantly the astounding ministry she was offered. To bear in her womb infinite weight and lightness, to carry in hidden finite inwardness 9 months of eternity, to contain in slender vase of being the sum of power, in narrow flesh the sum of light, then bring to birth, push out into air, a man-child, needing, like any other, milk and love, but who was God. This next poem, Wandering About an Albuquerque Airport Terminal by Naomi Shihab, is something that someone gave me as a gift. I did not know about this poem until about 3 weeks ago. I mean, I've read Nye, but I did not know this particular poem. And he said, "You've got to read this poem. It's about what we meet in this kind of spiritual group." And he said, "You've got to read this one, Paul." He said, "I think it'll mean something." And I loved it. I loved the poem right from the start, and I'd like to read this one because it's a poem really about breaking bread. It's a poem about communion. It's about a poem of coming together with the stranger. Okay. She says, "After learning my flight was detained 4 hours." Now this is going to be happening, I understand, more and more. Okay. unless something is done. After learning my flight was detained 4 hours, I heard the announcement, "If anyone in the vicinity of Gate 4A understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately." Well, one pauses these days. Gate 4A was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing loudly. "Help," said the flight service person. "Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be 4 hours late, and she did this." I put my arm around her and spoke to her haltingly. "Shudawa, shubiduk, habibti, stani shwe, min fadlik, shobit siwi." The minute she heard any word she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought our flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for some major medical treatment the following day. I said, No, we're fine. You'll get there, just late." "Who was picking you up? Let's call him and tell him." We called her son, and I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and would ride next to her southwest. She talked to him. Then we called her other sons just for the fun of it. And then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets? I know, and let them chat with her. This all took up about 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling about her life, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, out of her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the traveler from California, the lovely woman from Laredo, we were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There are no better cookies. And then the airline broke out the free beverages from huge coolers, non-alcoholic, and the 2 little girls for our flight, one African-American, one Mexican-American, ran around serving us all apple juice and lemonade, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country traveling tradition. Always carry a plant. Always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones and thought, this is the world I want to live in. The shared world. Not a single person in this gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, has seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. Excuse me. Boy, talk about coming together as a community, huh? With mamoul cookies, huh? Or communion. Now I'd like to read 2 of my own poems, and then just make a couple of points about how to write poetry and get it published and et cetera, become famous by next week. This one is called Putting Out into the Deep from Gloucester. Remember I told you that there was that week that the director said, what I want you to do, Paul, is write poetry. And this is one of the poems that came out of that experience. The sea wind whispers and the tall oaks shake, their leaves shimmering in the August noon. And now the dry grass wrinkles and the floorboards flame, saffron motes, a distant bird cry, this brackish sea. What was it you figured the wind might say? The oaks sway gently this way and that. Like young girls they sway, their long locks shaking in the golden green. They are singing to themselves, something only they can understand, the sequins of their shadows shimmering with song. Like some burning bush, touched only by the wind, they shine. For the past 2 days you've waited by the threshold, tied out, tied in, then out and in again, as if calling someone. Your old stone boat sits there on the shore, ready to take on those deeper waters as if it really could. Again, the plum-purple waves are beachward washing, each cold comber composed of spume and granite. And still nothing seems to happen the way you configured to yourself. though somewhere out there in those depths, continents collide, and somewhere dying stars implode. The frequencies of air are filled with foreign gargle, and all the indices are down or going under. Nowhere in Aquinas will you find a rationale for so-called private property, Father is exhorting, as his little congregation, composed mostly of seasoned religious women, nod their heads. Cold comfort there, you think, considering what you've already lost. But the gospel seems to back them. It's the scene where Peter goes out into the depths to fish as the Lord has told him to. And behold, the first fish he catches has money where its mouth is, enough to pay the noisome temple tax not once, but twice, for his master and himself. Found money, no? Mayhaps there is a lesson there for you. And if there is, pray tell me what it is. When Jesus, striding the blue-black waves there in the pre-dawn dark, called out to Peter to come to him, impetuous Peter leapt overboard at once. Somehow the yawing waves half steadied him, and with baby steps, or like a drunk man on the dizzying ice, began walking on the waters towards the bedazzling figure, who stood there like some blown beacon beckoning him. At which point, Peter must have told himself that this was easy. So who needed him? Which is when the rock went under, spluttering in that insane, gasping sea. Only Christ's fast grip upon his wrist had saved him then. How often he must have thought back on that shock moment to try and sort out what had happened. So take a moment now, O scholar of one candle, and look up from your desk. The oaks are quiet now, and the sun, that King of glory, has since moved on. The clouds, like full-fed crowds, are gone, and the choiring girls have turned again to trees. They know that somewhere, now as then, the wind keeps whispering still. And I'd like to end with a poem to my wife, which I stole, by the way. We were doing Lectio Divina, and I stole it from the Bible, okay? I stole it from Genesis. That moment before the fall, when Adam and Eve walk in the cool of the evening in the presence of God. I just love that image. When we walk together, for Eileen. When we walk together in the cool of the evening, walk together, you and I, in the cool of the evening, after the heat of the day, after the long hours under the sweating sun, after the buzzing words like black flies had at long last ceased their querulous stinging, after the questions, after the answers that refused at last to answer anything at all, in the cool of the evening, when we walked in the garden, you and I, in the cool of the evening. When it was no longer important for either of us to speak, since the words, whatever words they might have been, would have been beside the point, would have said nothing our hearts did not already know, where simply being there in the cool of the evening was all that finally mattered. With the long night coming on, and the last trill of birdsong fading off in the distance by the ridge of the tree line, when we walked together there in the garden, in the cool of the evening, you and I. Okay, just a few comments here. If you'll turn to the next page, key points for the seminar. You ready for all the key points now? Here we go. I stole this from Father Jim Martin, a Jesuit, whom I love very much. He's a good friend of mine, and he just seems to always get it right. or most of the time. Here's Father Jim Martin on the Ignatian composition of place, used for the sake of poetry here. So when we speak composition of place, we think of prayer, but I want you to also think about composing a poem, about how to go about one way about going about composing a poem. He says, essentially, because I've learned a great deal from the Jesuit exercise, I have to tell you, really. Even before I made them, I realized that there was a real, I'd been using them, or a form of them, for a long time before that. And then it was almost like Ignatius was just explicating it for me. Essentially, in imaginative prayer, you attempt to place yourself in a biblical scene by using your imagination. Well, you can start with a biblical scene, and then, of course, you can go on. It can be a scene you remember your grandmother, or you remember a pet, or you remember your son or your daughter, or you remember a stressful situation, or you remember a peaceful situation, and you focus on that. You stay with that. You stay with it. You meditate on it. Okay? And then with time, and you need time. There's no way around this. You can't be twittering, etc. Okay? You can't be texting. You really have to focus on this. Okay, what else is going on? I'm going to tell you a little story here. I'll tell you how this can work. This is an ad lib, okay? Years ago, I was asked to become the dean at Notre Dame. Okay, I know. I had just written. I know. Yeah, what a mistake. Anyway, at that time, this was the early '80s. I had just published this enormous book, about 900 and some pages, on William Carlos Williams. Okay, and so they were looking for, quote, a Catholic intellectual, and so they said, yeah. They wanted one. So Tim O'Mara drove out this way. He said, I'm coming out here, I'm dropping my daughter off, and I'll like to take you out to lunch down in Amherst. And we talked, and he said, I want you to come to Notre Dame. And I said, well, he said, well, come on out. We'll make you an offer you can't refuse. So I did. I went out, and it was very, very nice. Father Hesburgh was there then. And I was really drawn. I mean, first of all, they were going to double my salary overnight, okay? They were going to send all my sons to college for nothing. I mean, okay? So I talked to my wife about it, and she came out to South Bend, and she wasn't happy. I mean, being from New York, if she could have somehow pulled South Bend down to Brooklyn, say, or the Bronx, so it might have worked, but this wasn't going to work. And then I remember going upstairs, and I had my 3 boys up there, and I was reading them a story, and I remember my middle son said, Daddy, don't do this to me. I got friends here, you know. And it really kind of hit me. It really, don't do it, Dad. You know, please don't do this. So I went to a priest friend of mine, and what I did is, Father John Johnson, he's passed since, but he used to do like a light hypnosis. He said, look, just to kind of center me or focus me, okay? And he said, look, why don't you, we'll try this out, okay? So he said, so we got into a room, and I sat there, and he said, okay, now I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to, there's a beautiful elevator, and it's got all kinds of bells on it and everything like that, all kinds of neon lights. It's gorgeous. He says, I want you to go into that elevator and push the button down. Go down. So, this took longer than I'm saying it, so we focused. Go down, down, So finally, okay, we get down to the bottom, and he says, okay, now open the elevator. So I push the button, I open it. He said, what do you see? I said, I see a lawn. I see a beautiful stretch of lawn, green lawn in front of me, composition of place. He said, okay, now walk out of the elevator and tell me what you see. So I walk out of the elevator, and I say, oh my God, there's my father. There's my father. He's got a payloader, that's the kind of work we did. He's got a payloader, and he's driving across this field, and he's got the bucket on the payloader up like this. And he said, well, follow him. So I followed him. He says, okay, now what? He said, well, he just stopped the payloader, and he's in front of, oh my God, it's a cemetery. Okay. He said, has he stopped in front of any particular place? He said, yeah, there's a stone there. He said, okay, can you read it? Okay, I go over. My father takes the payloader, meanwhile, takes the bucket, turns it upside down, and all this money, gold, jewels, everything falls out of it, okay? And he dumps it right on this cemetery plot. I said, can you read what it says on the stone? I said, oh my God, it's my name. It's my name. He said, okay. He said, what does this tell you? I mean, you don't have to be Freud, you know, to figure this one out, you know, or Jung, or, you know. So I said, well, I guess I'm not going to Notre Dame. And so I called Father Hesburgh, and I said, Father, my job is to teach and to write. I'm sorry, as much as I would like to do this, I can't do it. And everybody I've told the story to says, are you crazy, man? No, only my best friends have said that to me. But no, so I didn't go. I didn't. But it's just how these things can work. You know, this composition of place when you start to meditate on something and go deep into it. So what does he say here? He says choose. He says, for example, he says take St. Mark. Today is St. Mark's, right? Feast day. Today, right? Yeah. St. Mark's feast. Mark's account of the healing of the paralyzed man in Mark 2. In this marvelous story, the man's, you remember it maybe, huh? Friends cut a hole in the roof because they want to get the person that they've got with them who's paralyzed down in there. And so they use some ingenuity. Instead of waiting out there, they climb up on the roof, cut through the thatch, and bring it down, and bring their friend down. As in any prayer, you first ask for God to be with you, remembering that any grace you receive in prayer, grace in prayer is in itself a gift from God, and this will do for poetry. I have to tell you, for me, not for a lot of people, but for me, poetry is a grace, okay? Poetry is a grace. Why? I'll tell you why. Here's why, okay? When I was 35, I had written some poems. I actually won $10 once, okay? And I bought a rosary for my Lutheran mother. She was delighted. And I remember that I stopped writing after that, and I said, I'm going to be a professor. You know, I can't write poetry. I'm going to have to teach it. That's how I'm going to make bread. And then when I was about 35, they asked me, I was a member of what they call a Cursillo. Some of you made that name, and the Father Eddie Key said, I want you to be the rector on this weekend. I was 35. I didn't think I was ready, but he said, you're going to do it. I mean, will you do it? Excuse me. So, or the same thing. Right? So I said, okay, I'll do it, Father. So it was an extraordinary experience. I had no idea how deep it was going to go. But after the Cursillo weekend was over, we did this up in North Adams, in the western part of the state. And when it was over, we all went down to say a prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament downstairs. And when it came my turn, I said, I don't want anything. I'm just so thankful that I had this, this opportunity. And the Spirit said, stop it, will you? He said, ask for something, will you? So I said, well, if there's one thing, if I could have it, I'm 35 now, right? If I could have this, I will do my best with it, okay? And he said, I'd like to write poetry again, like I did when I was a teenager. And that was it, okay? So I went home, and in the next 6 months, I wrote an entire book of poems, okay? But it has to be, anytime I try to stray away from that, remember, sort of like, then I lose it, do you know what I mean? So it's a bond, okay? It's been given to me personally as a gift. That's what I'm saying here, it's a gift. And so I respect that gift, okay? So, all right. So here we go. So you get this. What do I see? What do I hear? What do I smell? You really try to compose this in your mind, and as this happens, the imagination is working all the way through it. You see, and what does he say about the imagination? He says, On the next page, I won't read this all, he says, this is Jim Martin, okay? He says, imaginative prayer involves trusting that God is at work through your imagination, and through whatever emotions or insights you may experience. At first, this was hard, he says, for me to accept. Praying like this seems silly, as I told my spiritual director in the novitiate. Isn't it all in my head, I asked? Aren't I just making it all up? His wise answer freed me from my doubts. You believe that God can work through all sorts of things in life, through your mind, your heart, your soul, right? Yeah, I said tentatively. So why can't God work through your imagination? Of course, not every experience of imaginative prayer will feel satisfying or produce earth-shattering results. Sometimes it will be dry, and there will be dry periods. But that doesn't mean nothing's happening. Something very deep is happening. You're just not aware of it. You can't quite articulate it yet, you see? Yeah, that's really, yeah. But even in these seemingly dry prayer periods, you are spending time with Jesus in the world of the Gospels. Spiritual transformation is taking place at a deep level, even if you can't see it. Spending time with God always changes us. Other times, though, this kind of prayer plunges you right into your favorite gospel passage. There you are in the middle of it, noticing things that you never noticed before about Jesus, about the apostles, about the people he touched, about first century Palestine, about yourself. And once that happens, you may never again hear that gospel story in the same way. Now I say, apply this to your own writing and to your own poem. Do the same thing with the composition of place and focusing. Go deep into yourself. Go deeper and deeper. I know when I teach poetry here, this often happens. It takes weeks sometimes before the students are really ready. They think that they know what the poetry, all of us really, And then after you gain their trust, hopefully, they go deeper. They go deeper. I remember having a Jewish student 2 years ago. This is an extraordinary. He was all over the place. He'd traveled all over, et cetera. He was a good-looking guy. He had a lot of girlfriends, the whole bit, okay? All right. And this was in a memoir class, which was in many ways the poetry. I mean, the language was very poetic, And then he explained. He said, I was in Barcelona, I was in Vienna, I was in Venice, I was in Rome, I was in Florence, I was in Berlin. He said, and then I went down to, because I'm Jewish, he said, I went down into the Negev desert, okay, south of Jerusalem. And he said, I met a group of other Jewish students, young men and women like myself, and they were from all over the world, Australia, they were from South America, they were from Europe, Canada, etc. And he said, there we were around a fireplace, and we were singing a song in Hebrew. And he said it was an extraordinary experience. And I said, you've just touched something, perhaps for the first time this semester, that really is you, right now. I said, don't let this go. Don't, just brush it off. Stay with this and see what happens. About a year later, last year, he wrote me an email. He was back in Jerusalem. And he said, I think I found what I was looking for. So, this is how these things can work. Sometimes it takes years to get, sometimes the poems come like grace notes, boom, like that, Other times it may take months as you dig deeper. What is it that I'm after? What is it that I want to say here? So I would suggest that, you give those a try, okay? And then secondly, very quickly here, the sacramental aspects of the everyday. Some of you said, Father Hopkins, for example, finding in the world around him that sense of God's presence. Discerning the presence of the mystery in the everyday world around you. Think about that. I wouldn't advise this, though, while you're driving on 91, okay? I remember looking at these beautiful cloudscapes, and I'm going 75 miles an hour, and I had to back off on that one, or I wouldn't be here today. But I mean, you can actually get into these moments, just looking at, Hopkins used to look at clouds, or he'd look up at the stars at night. I mean, how often do we come home at night and we don't even take, say, 10 seconds to just look up, at the moon or the stars? Is the moon right now waxing, or is it waning? Which is it? It's what? It's what? It's full. Okay, good. There was a trick question. Okay. You might be inside watching television, and suddenly you notice, where's that light coming from outside? And you think, but it's coming from the moon, It's, or the birds in the morning, these days, I know I have a nephew who says, every time I hear those birds, they wake me up, I want to break their heads. I said, Patrick, cool it, man. There's more to it than that, Close your eyes, focus, pray, let that deeper world within you, a world shaped by what we experience in our world every day, speak to you with or without words. Listen for its promptings. In some deep way, this is true, I believe this, we are all poets who use our imaginations every single day, whether we write poetry or not. I believe that. We all have that poetic instinct. So I'm going to stop here and open it up to a series of questions. Anybody who would like to. There was one question you had asked about Hopkins. I'm going to try to answer that now. You were right. When you said that you had been in Wales, right? Yeah, and it's true. One of the things that transformed poetry, Hopkins actually transformed poetry, even though in his own lifetime he published virtually nothing. It was only 30 years after his death that Robert Bridges, his close friend who was then Poet Laureate in England, published a slim volume of Father Hopkins' work, 30 years after his death, okay, in the last year of the war, World War I. One of the things that Hopkins learned that changed his whole way of looking at poetry was being in Wales and hearing the Welsh, like the Irish, hearing that language so close to London, where he'd grown up in Hampstead, but hearing the lilt of that language, he loved it. He loved it, and he asked. Here's what he did. He asked his superior if he could please learn Welsh so that he could convert the Welsh, and the superior said, "Gerard, you're not going to transform. It's not that easy." But yes, you can go out and you can learn Welsh, okay? So he went, there was an old woman who lived about a half a mile away, and he would go to her for the Welsh lessons. He learned it, he learned the Welsh language, he learned Welsh poetry, and it changed with a deep, beautiful vowel chiming of the Welsh, of the Celtic, you see. It transformed what English language was capable of doing, just like that. What him and that relationship with that elderly woman who taught him, Welsh. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's doff and dapple dawn, drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling level underneath him, steady air, that kind of sound. And you can actually hear the hawk, or feel the hawk, as it moves around. And yeah, he did. He changed poetry. He extended himself. I'm doing the same thing. It's turning out I did a biography of William Carlos Williams, and one of the things I didn't realize when I wrote it, I was 40 when it was published. So one of the things I didn't realize is how deep that Carlos in the name William Carlos Williams was. And it's only over the years as other poets, Latin American poets, have come to the fore and shown me just how deep that relationship is, how many times, for example, they've discovered quite a few poems that Williams translated from the Spanish, you see. One of them he translated was a book by Quevedo, which he translated when his mother, who was in her 90s at that point, in order to get her to talk about herself, he would sit by her bedside and he'd say, "We're going to translate Quevedo, Mom, this kind of folksy, this is a book that was written about the time of Shakespeare." But what he was really hoping for is that she would tell him who she was, you know what I mean? What her background was, who she was as a human being. And she kept watching him. Are you trying to learn something about me? But he did get enough information. But the point is that it was that connection. She was from Puerto Rico, and that Spanish tradition that he was able to pick up, and it just enriched his own. And here's a guy who's writing what they call poetry in the American idiom. And what I'm learning is that he got the American idiom from the Spanish. I mean, this, of course, why not? We speak about American, it's North America, but it's also so much more South American. But what Williams would do is he'd take the poetry from the Spanish poets and then translate that. And he said, this is different from anything that they're doing in the English tradition, the English literary tradition. It's new. It's fresh, you see. It's one of the things about translation that paying attention.